So as Laurentians, we know that you love to connect and engage with the people and places that you love, like Lawrence and Bjorklunden. And in the typical Lawrence spirit, all of the speakers lined up for the Learning at Lawrence series are paying it forward. They're giving their time and their talent to the institution and the programs that we all treasure, like Bjorklunden and Lawrence. So with that, I want to thank Robert Spoo, class of 1979, for your willingness to be a presenter in this new forum. And if anyone has any questions for Bob, they can put them in the chat function in the Zoom meeting, and I will ask them of him at the end of the presentation. So with that, Bob, I'm gonna stop my video and mute myself, and you can start sharing your screen.
Okay, I'll do that. Let me just begin by seeing if I can upload my, and I want to know from you guys, Shane, if you still are, anybody can let me know for sure that they can see this. Let's see. Is that, okay, so you can see it. Okay, terrific. Let me welcome everybody. I'm really so pleased. I saw, I had a preview of the list of folks, many names on it I recognized, and was immediately gratified to see friends that I have not seen for some time were on there. Some individuals who have been Bjorklunden seminarians with me on occasion. Some of you are on there, and I'm so sorry we couldn't meet in person in northern Wisconsin this year, but I'm sure things one day will be back to normal. Let me also say, for those of you who may have seen me recently, these I have rather red circles under my eyes, and this is my annual trip into the poison ivy patch in my yard. For some reason, I never avoid it. I never apparently take the proper precautions, and so this is not an attempt to give an illustration of the picture of Dorian Gray. It just is the way I actually look at the moment. So that's the reason for the bit of redness around my face. It was a lot worse about 2 days ago. So folks, let's jump in. This began as a Bjorklunden 5-day, 3-hour-a-day seminar plan, and naturally we can't get into 2 novels as complex as these in just an hour. But what I thought I would do is take the notion of portraits in particular and work particularly with those both painted and photographic portraits of our 2 authors and related and in some cases elements within the novels, and sort of bounce out of or off of the notion of portraits. And then we'll get a little bit into the novels as well, and I certainly hope that if there are any questions that you have, maybe we can dig a little bit further into them. What you see in front of you are 2 very famous portraits of respectively Wilde and James Joyce. The one of Wilde, incidentally, was done by Toulouse-Lautrec right in the midst of Wilde's legal troubles, right before his conviction for gross indecency, which we'll talk about in a moment. And Wilde did not want to pose for Toulouse-Lautrec. And what Lautrec did was to have an evening with him, and then when he got back to his lodgings, he did this from memory. This was his memory of what Wilde looked like on the eve of his conviction and sentence for 2 years at hard labor for gross indecency. The photograph of the image of James Joyce is far more, I think, relaxed and posed. That is a famous image by him by Jacques-Émile Blanche, 1935. He's now the famous author of Ulysses, and is on his way to becoming the famous author of Finnegan's Wake. You know, despite there being two Irish authors, I think you could almost not find two Irishmen who were more different in their upbringing, in their background. Wilde comes from an Anglo-Irish, uh, Protestant, you know, um, um, line of ancestors. His father is a very noted surgeon, ear surgeon in Dublin. His mother is a famous patriot and poet whose pen name was Speranza. She wrote Irish revolutionary poetry in the 19th century. Wilde grew up in that protected world of privilege, largely growing up. He attended Trinity College in Dublin, which is the Protestant-based college in Dublin. He was very successful there. He received the Berkeley Gold Medal in Greek, for example. He made a great career at Trinity College, then went on to Oxford, Magdalen College, where he received, much to everyone's surprise, because he'd been, in a way, to a lot of people's surprise, because he'd been a kind of a, he traveled a lot. He seemed to neglect his studies. He seemed to prefer to be an aesthetic dandy at Oxford rather than a student. And he received a double first and knocked everybody out. And he also received the Newdigate Prize for his poem, which is the best poem by an undergraduate. So he was a great hit there. But he really came to the public's attention in 1882 when he came to the United States. He came to the United States really as a kind of billboard for a Gilbert and Sullivan light opera called Patience, or Bunthorne's Bride, which you may have seen or know of. And it is the opera by Gilbert and Sullivan that is a send-up of the aesthetic decadent movement. In fact, there is a character that is modeled in part on Oscar Wilde. And so Wilde came as a sort of appendage of the Gilbert and Sullivan tour of that play in the United States. And like certain very talented appendages, he suddenly became the head. He launched himself. He became very famous in the United States, and then took that fame back with him to Britain. But here's an image of him by Max Beerbohm, a reconstructed image of him in 1916 lecturing in the United States. He had a famous lecture tour. He lectured on what he called the Renaissance in arts, and he lectured on how to beautify the American home. In other words, he was a kind of an embodiment of the aesthetic movement in the late 19th century. And he wore the kind of costume that you see there, a costume of velvet jacket, knee breeches, and he did carry flowers, in this case, the lily. As you may know from the lyrics of Patience, there is a song about one of the very aesthetic individuals carrying a poppy or a lily in his medieval hand. And this is Wilde lecturing a very stern, rather uncomprehending group of Americans, with Abraham Lincoln in the background scowling, a portrait of Lincoln in the background scowling, flags over his head, whereas Wilde is carrying the lily. But the flower that he was really associated with was in the United States tour was the sunflower. The sunflower became a very popular image for him, and in fact, he created a real craze for a number of things, including the sunflower as a kind of emblem of aesthetic life. And they sold millions of trinkets and sort of toys and fake sunflowers, real sunflowers, and these were sold all as a part of celebrating Wilde. Now, this image doesn't look much like Wilde. It came from one of the newspapers or magazines during his tour, but it is a notion of Wilde kind of entering into his own kingdom on his own. It looks like his own ass there, or donkey, followed by the townspeople of San Francisco and so forth. They made a great hit there. The reason that not many photographs were popularly reproduced of Wilde during his tour of America in 1882 was he signed an exclusive photography agreement with a famous celebrity photographer of the day in New York named Napoleon Sereny. And Sereny had exclusive rights to reproduce Wilde by photographic image, and therefore very few photographs of Wilde other than the Sereny photographs circulated in the United States. This is, I'm sure you're familiar with this image of Wilde. There were, Sereny had a New York studio in which he photographed all the great personalities of the day. He was, I don't know, Richard Avedon, whoever you want to compare him with in modern times, but he was the go-to guy if you wanted to be captured in a photograph and circulated. And Wilde's image here became mass reproduced during his tour and after. So famous did his image become that this very image became the basis of a lawsuit, a copyright lawsuit, in which this image of Wilde was reproduced in a whole bunch of different places, including in ads for women's hats. This would be part of Wilde's Renaissance, you know, the beautifying of America, and he was being exploited by all kinds of merchants and things. And this resulted in a lawsuit that went up to the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, that found in favor of the plaintiff, Sereny, the photographer. And it's interesting that photographs come up, as you may remember if you've read Picture of Dorian Gray. You may remember that Lord Henry Wotton, who is, of course, the person who inspires Dorian Gray with the philosophy of aesthetics, Lord Henry has 27 photographs, or actually in the magazine version, is 27 photographs of of Dorian Gray in his house. In the book, it's 18 photographs. Changes it to 18. Well, it turns out that Napoleon Sereny made 27 total photographs, different photographs of Wilde, and the photograph that was litigated and went up to the Supreme Court was number 18. And I think that those numbers are significant for the book, and I think that Wilde is thinking of his photograph but his series of photographs by Sereny. So here's another famous image of Wilde by Carlo Pellegrini. Here we have Wilde in his kind of evening dress. Here's how he would look when he appeared at parties and dinners and dances and such. Not yet at the height of his popularity, it's only growing. He's already got this reputation as an aesthete, but he has not yet become the great playwright. Here is it's now famous. It was not famous for a long time. It may be Oscar Wilde's favorite portrait of himself. It is 6 feet tall, and it was done by an American, Robert Pennington, in 1884, again before Wilde's great fame, but when he was rising as a sort of figure of the aesthetic movement. Wilde had this photograph above his fireplace, tall fireplace. And it was among the effects of Wilde that were sold by forced sale after Wilde's conviction, right in the midst of his litigation when he was in danger of, he was going to owe his opponent, Marquis of Queensberry, a large amount in attorney's fees, and there was a forced sale of his effects. It was a dreadful thing. His manuscripts, his letters and things were all sold in his own house, including this painting, which was purchased by a friend and then eventually found its way to the United States, where it currently is. And only in recent years, I think, has this portrait become widely known and the image reproduced, because for a long time it was lost as a result of almost a bankruptcy sale of Wilde's effects. This is kind of a relaxed pose of Wilde, atypically turned almost away from the viewer, relaxing there with a cigarette in his left hand as he gazes out at something. He seems to be wearing one of his elaborate coats. And here we are approaching Wilde's great years. It's just before he becomes famous for his great plays, Lady Windermere's Fan, Ideal Husband, and so forth, those plays of the 90s. And here we have Wilde by Bierbaum again, and here we have the true kind of decadent Wilde, the aesthetic Wilde tipping over into the decadent Wilde. Here is Wilde in his opera cape and outfit, and looking quite a bit like more like an Aubrey Beardsley sort of image almost, picking up this kind of highly artificial look of Wilde and the field. Notice Wilde's curled hair as well, especially curled with hot irons and things. Well, of course, Wilde's legal difficulties began and ended with his friend and lover, Lord Alfred Douglas. Wilde, of course, was a married man with 2 children, but he also led another life, though he made no real secret of his relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas. And Douglas was from a noble aristocratic family whose father, the Marquis of Queensberry, hated Wilde and actually hunted Wilde and his son, Lord Alfred, hunted him and threatened that if he found them in a restaurant or in a coffee shop together, that he would whip them publicly. And he also threatened to shoot them and so forth. And then Lord Alfred Douglas threatened to shoot his father. It became a mess. Eventually, Wilde, very unwisely and largely at Douglas's urging, sued the Marquis of Queensberry for criminal libel. He instituted an action for criminal libel, which he lost because Queensberry was able to put on evidence that Wilde really did have a series of relationships with young men. And then once he lost that verdict, the Crown turned on Wilde and prosecuted Wilde for what was called gross indecency. And in the course of 2 trials, Wilde was convicted of gross indecency. It was a misdemeanor, but it led to 2 years. They gave him the maximum, which was 2 years at hard labor in one of the British prisons. And this is an image, you could say another portrait of Wilde, in this case at the criminal courts, the Old Bailey, where he is being questioned in the dock by counsel. And there you see the jury, an all-male jury in the background, with the judges then there on the right side. This was depicted in the London Police News. Well, let's jump to Joyce for a moment. Joyce is also a famous figure, less famous in painting portraiture than I think in photographic portraiture. Of course, Joyce is 30 years younger than born 30 years after Wilde or so, more in the age of the photograph. And I think that if there is a modernist figure that is a figure of modernist literature that is the subject of photography, certainly Joyce is one of them, if not the most typical figure in that. But here he is, much younger, at University College Dublin. Now, Joyce, in contrast to Wilde, comes from a Roman Catholic family. which when he was very young was moderately middle-class prosperous, but as a result of his father's wasteful ways, the family declined and declined in terms of economic status, and the Joyce family moved literally, I think, dozens of times between Joyce's birth and this period of his life. Wilde goes to, Joyce goes to the University College Dublin, which is the recent Catholic university established in Dublin by Cardinal Newman. He's a noted student. He's recognized as a very talented person by the faculty and by his fellow students. He studies languages, modern languages, and takes his degree in 1902, and then fairly shortly leaves in 1904 and came back to Ireland a couple of times, but really leaves for the most part for the continent, where he lived most of his life in self-exile from Ireland. And we do have some famous drawings and paintings of Joyce, but these are two. One is by Wyndham Lewis, and possibly, Wyndham Lewis was another modernist author, but also a noted modernist painter and portraitist, perhaps one of the greatest portraitists of the 20th century, if you put together his many great portraits. This is a pen drawing of Joyce, simple it seems, but very effective. On the other side is something by the Romanian artist Constantin Brancuș, who got to know Joyce a bit in Paris and did a number of illustrations or images of him, including this one called Symbol of Joyce, which is a portrait of sorts. It is after Ulysses, and it's into the Finnegan's Wake years, and Joyce has already become something iconographic, a symbol of modernism as much as a person. When Joyce's aging and always dryly witty father saw this image, he is reported to have said, the Brancuș image, he's reported to have said, Jim has changed a great deal since I last saw him. And he had, of course, in other ways. Also famously photographed. Joyce was famously in a series done by Man Ray, the American modernist photographer and artist. Man Ray did a number of images of Joyce. These are in the Ulysses years. Beatrice Abbott did a number of very important images, photographic images of him, including of the sort of pirate eye-patched Joyce. Of course, he famously had eye difficulties. In fact, was almost blind in one eye, and had many operations on his eye. And so part of Joyce's iconographic portraiture is his eye problems, which we can also see. I think you can see it quite clearly in this rather late photograph, a series of photographs by Giselle Freund, where you can see that one of his eyes has had a great deal of work done on it. It's actually a different color from the other one. That series of photographs by Giselle Freund resulted in a time cover for Joyce in 1939. Well, Joyce was very aware of Oscar Wilde, and he wrote a famous essay on Wilde in which he criticized the English people for condemning Wilde, for really sacrificing Wilde to their Puritan English conscience. Joyce said that his greater crime, the crime greater than the gross indecency for which he was convicted, was that he caused scandal in England. And that, he said, the English never forgive you for, causing scandal to them, and they punished him appropriately. He also, strangely, considered Wilde, like other Irish writers, to be a court jester to the English, in that Wilde became a popular figure and, in a sense, entertainer for the English. And Joyce was concerned about that role and worried that he himself might become co-opted into being a kind of Irish entertainer rather than a serious author. Not that he didn't think that Wilde was a serious author, but he worried about that that possibility of being kind of appropriated by the English. Incidentally, this image is a false portrait of Wilde. Some people thought this is actually an image of from an early performance of Salome, Wilde's strange and abstract and rather cruel play called Salome. This is the Richard Strauss opera version. And this was thought to be a portrait of Wilde in drag playing Salome. And in fact, the famous biographer of Wilde, Richard Ellman, put this photograph in his biography and said that it was Wilde, but it's since turned out that it's not Wilde. It just sort of looks like Wilde, but it is actually a woman who was playing that role in around 1910. Well, the picture of Dorian Gray, we can say a few words, spend a few minutes talking about it. It came out in two versions. One complete in Lippincott's magazine in the United States, first came out as a complete novella there. And then a year later, with changes and some expansions, it came out as a book in London and New York. Now, there's a real difference between the two. The magazine version is far more risque, far more controversial, contains passages that clearly glance at gay male experience and desire. That's still there in the book version, but it is more muted. It has been revised to be a little less scandalous. There had been an outcry against the magazine version, a famous outcry against the magazine version, one of which a critic talked about Dorian Gray's sins, and Wilde retorted in a response in the newspaper saying, nobody really knows, because he hadn't spelled it out clearly, nobody really knows what Dorian's sins are. If you have found them, you have brought them. Wilde insisted always on turning the tables on his critics. So, and just a few thoughts for those who have read the novel recently or at some point and may remember some of this. A large part of the novel is the struggle, you could say the struggle for Dorian Gray's soul between two people, one of them being Basil Hallward, the man who paints the picture of Dorian Gray, and Lord Henry, the dandy aesthete, who really teaches Dorian to be a dandy and an aesthete himself. And Basil, the painter, is a very Victorian figure. He spouts a sort of sober, somber Victorian morality, a very correct view of things, whereas Lord Henry is scandalous and irreverent and full of witticisms and full of dangerous playfulness. And there's a struggle for a wild soul, and it is something like the medieval psychomachia or soul battle between an angel and a devil. That goes back to Prudentius and possibly before, but we see it, of course, in the very popular, little angel and devil that appear on the shoulders of some figure in popular culture struggling for his soul. That's going on in the novel. You could say that Lord Henry wins that battle because in the end, while Dorian, I often say Wilde when I mean Dorian Gray, Dorian Gray is does become a sort of amoral aesthete and goes the way of Lord Henry in many ways. Just a few thoughts in images that apply to the book. There are a number of references to art, lots of references to art and sculpture in the book. One of the references early on is to Antinous, who was the young male lover and favorite of the Roman Emperor Hadrian. The subtext of gay male desire is very much recorded in the images of art and sculpture that are referred to in the novel. There is that famous moment in chapter 2, I think it is, of Picture of Dorian Gray, where Dorian is posing for the portrait painted by Basil while Lord Henry speaks to him from sitting lounging in a chair, and you see Dorian's face suddenly come alive with awareness, a sort of disturbing new awareness about life, which in some ways makes me think of a famous Victorian painting called The Awakening Conscience. It's in the Tate Gallery, and it is about a sort of sexual awakening, but of course it's a woman sitting, been playing the piano with her bow, and suddenly sits up with that kind of look of awareness and arousal in her face. That seems to me to be something of what's going on in that moment where Dorian, standing on the platform being painted, is being awakened to many things by Lord Henry's kind of scandalous language. Not to dwell on these too much, there are references to, lots of references to Shakespeare in the book. One of them is to one of the favorite roles that his very brief relationship with Sybil Vane is the Shakespearean actress that Dorian falls in love with and then tragically jilts. She plays Rosalind in As You Like It, which is a famous cross-dressing role, a famous role in which she cross-dresses as a male shepherd. Another image that is very, very important in the book is the image of Narcissus. Dorian is thought to be looking at himself constantly. In fact, at one point, he stealthily approaches the painting of himself and kisses it. This is clearly a Narcissus moment, which of course is captured in a lot of Victorian art and iconography as well. There is in Picture of Dorian Gray that moment where Lord Henry sends the yellow book, a book in yellow covers. We're never told much about it except, well, we're told a lot of its contents, but not the author or anything. This yellow book is the poisonous book, because when Dorian reads that book, it changes his life. It's clearly a book about aesthetic and decadent life. It's a book in French, and it is the yellow book that even Dorian himself says, Lord Henry, you must not send that to anyone else because it corrupts them. It will poison them as it did me. The reference is clearly to a book by a French decadent writer named Huysmans, named À rebours, or Against the Grain in English, and the figure in it is very similar to what Dorian Gray goes through with all of his rituals of medieval costumery and his jewelry collection and his gems and stones and all those things. There's a whole couple of chapters, as you know from the book, in which Dorian is focused on his collections, and that is clearly a reference to similar experiences by this figure, Des Esseintes, in the Huysmans novel. Not, again, to spend a great deal of time with it, but this notion in Dorian Gray of experience being something of value for its own sake, and this celebration of the sensations of life and the experiences and the senses, much of that comes from Walter Pater, the English art historian and Oxford Don, whom Wilde studied under. And there's a very famous conclusion to Walter Pater's book called The Renaissance, in which this language about embracing the moment, passionate attitude in those about us, that should be the goal of life, should be experiencing these sensations. That became so controversial that later Pater deleted that conclusion from later editions of the book. Again, it was thought to be something of a poisonous book, a little like the book that Dorian Gray talks about. Well, here's an image of Basil Hallward about to be murdered by Dorian Gray, as you may recall, up in the attic when Basil finally sees the portrait that he painted, but he sees this aging, cruel, sinful face, and Dorian Gray murders Basil. And there is Basil in a famous image by Michael Ayrton, slumped over, murdered at the desk or table up in the attic schoolroom. Well, we can't go into it much, but there are lots of stories, especially in late Victorian literature, about double lives. Jekyll and Hyde is one of those, a doctor by day, but a madman and murderer by night. And that relates, I think, very clearly to the kind of thing, the doubleness that we see in Picture of Dorian Gray. There are lots of scenes, and this is often forgotten, how Wilde didn't live long enough. I feel that if Wilde had lived long enough, he would have written a great naturalist, realist novel. There are moments, if you remember, in Picture of Dorian Gray, where his descriptions of London life and the streets of London, particularly East London, the poorer slum sections, and also the opium dens that Dorian Gray visits, are very realistic in the manner of Joyce in Passages of a Portrait of the Artist and other places. There's Basil. I'm sorry. There's Dorian Gray himself, dead at the end. Of course, he threatens to slash the painting at the end. He wants to eliminate all evidence of his crimes and sins, and of course, he has turned the knife on himself. And he has found an old, wrinkled figure lying below the portrait, beneath the portrait, which now is restored to its youth and beauty. And so the picture of Dorian Gray reigns supreme. This is another sort of picture some of you may have seen or should see if you haven't. The movie version, probably the best of them, 1945. A Picture of Dorian Gray has George Sanders in it as Lord Henry Wotton. It's worth seeing itself. It's a well-known version of it. It's black and white except for images of the picture of Dorian Gray, and there's the before and after of Dorian Gray as imagined in the movie. Wilde himself in a famous letter said, I keep saying when I'm saying Wilde instead of Dorian Gray, so I must associate Wilde with Dorian Gray, but he said, Lord Henry is what the world thinks me to be. Dorian is what he would like to be in other ages, perhaps. But Basil Hallward was what he felt he really was, that is, the painter, which is an interesting thing. Not the role that a lot of people would have chosen for Wilde. That's what he said, at least on this occasion. So, and then, of course, an image of Wilde hung in one of the cells of the prison where he actually served his part of his 2 years, Reading Jail, the Ballad of Reading Jail, which Wilde wrote after his release. The only thing he really wrote, substantive thing that he wrote after he was released from prison in those last 3 years of his life. Well, James Joyce, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, we often confuse Joyce with Stephen Dedalus, the figure in that book. And there indeed is Penguin, a recent Penguin cover of the book, now in the public domain, so you know many versions of it are out. And there's a young James Joyce, probably around 21, 22, in Dublin before he's left for Europe. And we very typically see portraits of James Joyce on the cover of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. I thought I would kind of wind up with a few quick comparisons between the two novels, just a few suggested things before we wind up. Parallels, some things to think about as you look at the two novels. Well, One is when Dorian discovers Sybil Vane, which is, of course, in this theater, the Shakespeare theater, he loses his way in the east part of London, and he winds his way in a labyrinth of grimy streets and black grassless squares. He encounters this absurd little theater with, as he puts it, a hideous Jew who is the kind of the manager of the place. Look how similar that is to Stephen Dedalus's wandering in the streets of Dublin just before his encounter with the prostitute at the end of chapter 2. This is the famous part where he wanders into the brothel district. Look how similar the language is. The maze of narrow and dirty streets, the foul laneways, and even wondering whether he had strayed into the quarter of the Jews. I almost think, I know that Joyce was familiar with Picture of Dorian Gray, and these moments seem to me to be really quite similar, quite together. Dorian's reaction to the Yellow Book, which makes him at times want to indulge in a kind of ecstasy of religious experience, much of it aestheticized, is in a way similar to Stephen's reaction to that hell sermon when he hears the sermon by Father Arnall with the incredibly detailed and horrifying imagery of hell. He also goes into a kind of a reactive ecstasy of religious atonement and ritual, personal ritual, similar, I think, to what Dorian Gray experiences. There's a theme in both books of somehow choosing life with all of its sinful over religion. In Stephen's case, it's over the real possibility and the invitation to him to become a Jesuit priest. This notion of sin being part of life and part of experience that ought to be embraced. That's very much there. The notion of the realization of oneself. The aim of life, says Lord Henry in Dorian Gray, is self-development, to realize one's nature perfectly. That's there also very much in Picture of Dorian Gray. I'm sorry, in Portrait of the Artist. I will try to express myself in some mode of life or art as freely as I can, so forth. That idea of self-expression being paramount. The idea of the artist needing to create beautiful things and losing him or herself within them. That is, we look for art, not the artist. Even though, says the Dorian Gray indicates, we live in an age when men treat art as if it were meant to be a form of autobiography. Stephen Dedalus has a similar theory, that the artist should disappear into his work, and not be looked for or found. So those are some themes. I finish up with this image, which is a little bit of a melodramatic image of Dorian standing next to his aging portrait up in that attic room, with the dagger, of course, with which he will murder, or has just murdered, I don't know which, the painter Basil Hallward. So I'd be delighted to respond to questions that you might have. And just a few thoughts about these two novels and these two artists and these two sets of portraits.
Great. So we had some questions submitted in advance.
Okay.
And this is from Rufus Cadigan.